Welcome to series 2 of Crime Tapes. Now, throughout this series, we're still in a situation where we're dealing with the pandemic, and as a result of that, we're having to record these podcasts in a slightly different way, including from home. So the sound quality might not be that we had in series 1. Please do bear with us a little bit on the quality of sound, which throughout the series of episodes you might find is impacted by the circumstances that we're dealing with. Hi, you're listening to Crime Tapes. This is a podcast made by Staffordshire University, hosted by the School of Law, Policing and Forensics. And this season in particular, we're focusing on issues of policing. More specifically, in this episode, we're going to be talking about the policing of firearms. And I'm joined by Dr Rachel Bolton-King, who's here to talk to me about firearms in the UK just more broadly. Now, Rachel is fascinating and has all sorts of connections with firearms through her work as a forensic scientist. But firearms crime is an area that lots of people encounter in the media and sort of portrayed very, very often, but it's actually quite rare. It's an area where there are a lot of myths, a lot of disinformation, a lot of things that people simply don't necessarily know. And so what we're hoping to do through this is to talk not only about Rachel's expertise as a forensic scientist and how that informs what she does here at Staffordshire University, but also more generally about firearms, guns, crime scenes, and how we might encounter those specifically in policing the United Kingdom. Rachel, thank you for joining me.
Great to be here, James. Thanks for inviting me.
No, it's an absolute pleasure, and a topic I know straight away that people are going to find really, really interesting. I mean, we see firearms, don't we? You know, in high-level crime drama. I'm loath to mention programs on the BBC that are really popular, like Line of Duty. But the OCG is drilling firearms. There's guns everywhere. I think one episode of Line of Duty saw 5 people murdered with firearms in it. There were a lot of guns, high power weapons and so on. There's a lot of media attention on firearms crime, and last year we know, for example, that recorded levels of firearms crime, particularly in England and Wales, rose quite considerably. Although again, we've seen something of a drop more recently over the last year. Just as context, gun crime in the UK for 2020 was recorded as rising to more than 9,700 offences. But as I say, as we might expect with the current situation in the UK, that's fallen away a little bit now. But your expertise and your field in many ways is gun crime, and you hold a doctorate. You've been around the world studying gun crime. How did you become an expert on guns?
It's a great question. And to be honest with you, if someone had asked the 15-year-old version of me whether I'd be an associate professor and my field of expertise would be in firearms and forensic ballistics, I'd have said, no way, not a chance. Guns were definitely not on my radar. I didn't grow up in a farm or, surrounded by the shooting fraternity. But I always had a passion to be a forensic scientist. And I had a drive to be a practitioner. And so I always had that focus. But I very much thought I was more interested in analytical chemistry and drugs analysis. And it was only actually when I was doing my degree, my undergraduate degree, that I realised that there was a whole field of forensic science I literally knew nothing about, and this was firearms and ballistics. And so during that module, I really it's what I found as my forte. It was where I really began to get really interested, and something that I could actually bring all of my interest in science and maths together. Because in firearms, there is the chemistry element about how ammunition works. There is the physics and the mechanics about how firearms work. But then there's the biological content all around, wounding and what happens not only to living or deceased individuals when they're shot, but also what about the material properties? What happens to the actual surfaces of walls or cars or other types of objects that might be shot? And so this was really where my passion for this particular part of forensic science began. And I was just really fortunate to be able to pursue a PhD in this particular field, but actually looking at the imaging of fired bullets and fired cartridge cases. And that has kind of led me to now considering and working with law enforcement agencies, national and international forensic laboratories, police departments, etc., to really not only consider the underpinning science behind my field, but also, more importantly, how do we further increase the knowledge? How do we further gather information and evidence that can help us build cases, help us prosecute, help us maybe predict that gun crime may occur? And how do we actually prevent that violent crime, or the criminal use of firearms and its ammunition moving forwards into the future?
Yeah, and I mean it's a fascinating one, isn't it? Because straight away there's something of a mismatch, I would suggest at times, between what the public think of as sort of firearms crime, where those mediated images, kind of bound about, and we see lots and lots of guns in media. So it's almost kind of imagined that, the police are routinely encountering, firearms. They're a blight on the urban city centre. They're everywhere to be found. But actually, we're talking really about quite a small number of very extreme high-end cases, aren't we? Where there's going to be a great deal of focus on investigation, where it's those headlines, for example, of serious crime, but then that's with the use of firearms. There's a much more general kind of current that sits underneath all of that with firearms, and those can be all sorts of different things, can't they? When we talk about firearms, I think lots of people think we're talking about handguns or machine guns, but that's not always the case, is it?
No, definitely not. And so when we consider firearms, or guns, we're considering a whole body of objects that, and the majority of them are used completely legally. And any law that is passed typically is focused on negatively influencing all of those people who legally hold, have done for years, and will continue to have those objects legally. The problem, absolutely, and what we see in the media is very much around the most severe of those shooting incidents, typically where there's a fatality, there's a loss of life. And this can also occur with wildlife. But again, that doesn't necessarily feature within the media. Lots of criminal damage may actually occur. Also, violence with the use of a firearm that doesn't involve actually shooting somebody. It could be used to elicit fear, cause threat, elicit control over somebody. And all of that is due to the power and the potential threat of what could be done when you're actually faced with that particular firearm or that object. Yeah.
And it runs a whole continuum that could, on one hand, be, a high velocity, high end Scorpion machine pistol or assault rifle, through to a ball-bearing repeater gun or an air weapon as well, doesn't it? So there's a whole, so when we say you're an expert on firearms, yes, while you will have seen kind of, the serious and sophisticated criminal firearms, and I know you have, the other thing is, like as you were saying, the distinctions don't always necessarily work. And certainly if we talk about cases, for example, the cases where notorious, particularly I think spree shootings, like Dunblane, Hungerford, Cumbria with Derek Bird, Hungerford, obviously Michael Ryan and Dunblane Thomas Hamilton, going into the school where Andy Murray was a child tennis protege and shooting 15, I believe, of his classmates and also the teacher. Those crimes committed with legally held weapons at the time, which has kind of created a system in the UK where we have some of the most restrictive firearms legislation that you will find anywhere in the world. But as you rightly say, that legislation then impacts on a whole array of different people, because as you started off by mentioning, firearms do also have a legitimate function. If you're a farmer, for example, that needs to protect your boundaries from deer or your stock from foxes, or a firearm is going to be
fox and birds.
Absolutely legally held. Again, it's a big field, and when we talk about it in terms of crime, we often come at it straight away from those kind of extreme examples, but also I think in very much a way where we kind of think of guns as you say, the preserve of the kind of organised crime group in gritty social situations where it's about street drug dealing and Pablo the drug dog and it's handguns, and actually that's not necessarily what you spend all of your time investigating or looking at.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, on the one hand, that there are those shootings, so the criminal use of firearms is really diverse. So that could be from a farmer having a shotgun license, using it legally, and for whatever reason, his certificate has lapsed. So automatically that goes from being a legally held firearm to illegal possession. And interestingly, although a number of the figures declined during lockdown, illegal possession of weapons more broadly, not just firearms, actually remained about the same throughout the whole of last year, as we're aware to date. And likewise, a legally held firearm, someone could burgle a property with the intention to actually steal those firearms and the ammunition, and then go on to use them in crime. So not only is the theft against the law, but that literal you picking up an illegal firearm or having ammunition that you shouldn't have automatically becomes a criminal offence. So whether you're doing it for legal or illegal purposes. And then obviously then there's a further action around how you use that. It could sit on your mantelpiece forever and never be further used in a criminal offence. But obviously, if that firearm does end up in hands where that could be utilised for nefarious purposes, or bad actions, for whatever that illegal action, then unfortunately, that is a potential source of that divergence from legal to illegal. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's quite possible that there are people out there who are in possession of illegal weapons, for example, or ammunition as well, potentially, who don't necessarily know that they are. So again, it's that kind of, it runs a whole gambit, a continuum, so whereby we often sort of go towards and think of the most extreme examples.
You mentioned them, like Hungerford and Blaine. Interestingly, both of those cases resulted in major changes to the law in the UK. The Derek Bird, or particularly the West Cumbria incident, actually didn't involve any changes to law directly. They definitely updated guidance, they made recommendations, but because they were all utilising firearms that were legal at the time, so with the West Cumbria, he had a legally held rifle, he had a legally held shotgun, and therefore, the groups of individuals that use those types of firearms would have been massively impacted, if we were to have banned all firearms, which is actually what they suggested that we do after Dunblane and what the public called for. But there are reasons why we can't easily do that. And then another aspect of it is around, how then does the, ammunition itself? So one of the latest changes that maybe you're not aware of is actually the fact that the Antique Firearm Act came into effect this year. And this actually has removed a number of what we call calibers, so some size of ammunition and therefore firearms, actually said that they aren't antiques. They're actually, because they've been used illegally in crime, they've actually been taken off the antique list. And if you are to use these types of firearms and their ammunition in a criminal offence, and actually if you have these firearms and the ammunition, they're actually now prohibited. It's against the law. And, I don't think that this particular change in legislation has actually been widely and publicly advertised. And so just that, in case anyone is listening, in the year of 2021, there is a short time period where you can actually apply for a certificate to still have those firearms as curiosity weapons, for example, or whatever. But there are a number of these firearms and ammunition that have actually been moved to a prohibited category. And if you don't surrender them or get a certificate, you are actually in illegal possession of that weapon now.
And that has serious consequences potentially for people, doesn't it? Because, when it comes to, if you were to be proceeded against through the courts, understandably so, firearms crime carries heavy sentences, particularly because of the association with the potential harms that can result from it. You could quite easily see people receiving custodial sentences. And it's something that, again, that we don't necessarily consider as part of the wider range, perhaps, of how we talk about firearms crime. We talk about it very often as I say, it's all illegally held guns which are being used by drug dealing gangs. And I'm sure that people, not only in those dramas and so on, but they will see that sort of campaigns like the National Crime Agency, for example, have been very, very heavily involved in promoting the work that they do at and around firearms. And firearms crime necessarily, in many ways, comes to be the kind of the highest kind of category that we know of. I know there's been a campaign run by the National Crime Agency recently called Illegal Firearms, Know the Gun, Know the Law, and Know the Consequences, which has come with kind of video adverts and so on. But again, what you actually see with that as well is that the seizure of firearms and illegal firearms is although in some ways alarmingly high, 522 illegal firearms, I think, that the National Crime Agency seized in 19 to 20. I mean, that's more than one a day, yes. But then at the same time, if we think about it, it's also reassuringly low in some ways. It does also suggest to us that, we're not, and when you think about that number of firearms being the total, and that's, that will include stockpiles that are captured at any one point as well. Mm-hmm. We do live, I think, in an incredibly safe country when it comes to firearms. So I suspect that a large number of people involved in policing, crime, criminal justice in England and Wales will never really encounter a firearm.
That is absolutely the case. And when we consider how and what our UK gun crime looks like, and with the caveat that this is recorded crime. Yeah. As with any statistics that come out from related to police and the illegal use of weapons and etc. This is what we know about. This isn't, the actual truth of what happens. But comparably with other countries, the UK is incredibly low, comparable to a lot of countries in Europe, although some European countries do have a higher gun crime rate than ourselves. And in part that is due to legislation, but it's certainly not
What else accounts for a really low rate of gun crime, Rachel, do you think?
I don't think that actually our civilian firearm ownership was actually not necessarily that high before all of this legislation came into effect.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, in the same way, the people who did have firearms before Hungerford, which was in 1987, for example, they, you know, if they're still alive, they probably still have firearms now. They're all just still legally held.
Yeah.
Whereas it's the criminal group who want to use these firearms and the ammunition for, you know, bad purposes or for self-defense, which may or may not turn out to be end up in a criminal case, for example. But you know, those I'm really sorry, I've lost my train of thought. What was the question, James?
No, I was just saying, why is it that we have kind of low firearms? But you said rightly, you know, ownership levels have always been low in the UK
compared to the USA.
Yeah,
compared to the USA, our civilian population of firearm ownership was quite low.
Yeah.
Also, you know, we did used to have quite a big shooting competition, shooting community. That was obviously negatively impacted by the legislation that came in, and you know, detrimentally so, particularly to our Olympic athletes, for example, who now can't even train, for example, in the UK. They have to go abroad to do that. And so that is one of the reasons why they're quite low. Yes, absolutely. The legislation definitely played a part in that. But also, you know, our population are generally quite accepting of law and legislative changes. And so, you know, if something does legislatively change, so if a law comes into effect, they are likely to hand over those firearms if they know about it. You know, they don't want to have illegal possession. Sometimes we can, you know, there are compensation schemes that come into effect. So, for example, in 2019 there was another legislative change, the Offensive Weapons Act in 2019, where it wasn't just around firearms. This was rapid firing rifles, for example. It was also around knives, like flick knives. You know, they became prohibited, and therefore there was a surrender and a compensation scheme that was actually put into effect, so that if you'd have purchased them, you weren't losing out by then surrendering them to. And so, you know, our population does tend to, you know, follow that legislative change as well.
And that's interesting in a way, because it also tells us something about how those criminal groups get firearms, doesn't it? Because, you know, again, looking towards the National Crime Agency, already straight away it kind of frames it around, you know, importation and criminal groups and dodgy dealings, and we're not suggesting that doesn't happen at all, but it also does suggest that there is some bleed between those firearms that are legitimately owned by the population and those that are used for nefarious and criminal purposes, and that's certainly something that we do know is the case in the UK, don't we? I mean, it bears the question: how do criminals get guns? How do criminals get guns, Rachel?
Really, a wide variety of different routes. So yes, absolutely. Some particularly organised crime groups will know that there is not many firearms that are produced at all in the UK, and so generally legal firearms that our civilian population can hold, we tend to make those. So, for example, shotguns. Whereas anything that is illegal, so particularly things like pistols, revolvers, what they know that they can do is they actually import them. They bring them in from Europe, from lots of other countries, because we're an island, and they bring them in a format that is legal. So it might be a blank firing gun, for example. Or you might know these as starter pistols. So they basically make a loud noise, but don't shoot any projectile. They don't shoot a bullet, for example. And then what they do is they do something called a conversion. So they basically change bits of the firearm so that they can put in ammunition that can fire a projectile. Or we might have what we call something like a deactivated weapon. So in this case, most of what actually, from a forensic perspective, all of the bits in the firearm that they can actually cause the firearm to shoot ammunition get machined away, they get taken apart, they get or removed, and they basically change those bits and they add those components back in.
So it's like taking the shell of a car and putting an engine back into it so that it can run again, in a way.
Exactly, absolutely. In addition, farmers, as I mentioned earlier, they can steal firearms. In other countries, luckily, I don't think it's happened here, that to my knowledge, but definitely in other countries. James, you mentioned stockpiles earlier. So these are basically where governments or law enforcement or some organization has gathered a lot of firearms together, and they've basically created a pile. And sometimes these piles are very open, unsecure, and that is really rife opportunity for criminals to basically steal those weapons. But also you might have corruption within police forces or within the military. Again, this can result in those firearms, but not just firearms. Like, one of the key things, and I really want to emphasize this, is it's also the ammunition. So yes, the firearms are one part of it, but stockpiling of ammunition or production, so what we call craft production, so homemade, bespoke ammunition and firearms. This is another way that we can create weapons and ammunition that then gets out into the criminal community. So it isn't just about sourcing weapons that are already designed to shoot people. It's also about utilizing just general household objects, or having an inquiring mind, and you're an engineer, and I just wonder if I could 3D print this firearm or this component part.
That's an interesting one. Yeah, and as you mentioned, 3D printing, because there's been some stories, for example, about 3D printing and firearms. Clearly, in some instances, it runs up to the, can you print a firearm through 3D printing? And we know that it can be done, for example, and is it going to become more commonplace because it can be done? But as you rightly say, it's not just about the 3D printing of the firearm itself, is it? It's actually the harder thing for the criminal group to acquire in some ways, because of the amount of restriction that we have on most weapons. The harder thing for them to acquire is the ammunition, and therefore that it's actually the getting hold of and getting access to ammunition that becomes in some ways more of a challenge than the firearm itself.
Yeah, absolutely. So with the antique firearms, for example, so these are things that were manufactured, for example, before 1939, and obviously the changes that I mentioned in the latest act. But so generally these were things that you might see in your Civil War films, or things where you're basically loading everything in through the front of the firearm. So they're not cartridges, or cartridges that aren't made any longer. And so if you can't get hold of this ammunition, you've got to make it yourself. And that is really time consuming. You need loads of experience and equipment to be able to do it. But once you know how to do it, and if you've got the tools, you absolutely can. But it's not.
We're not going to ask you to reveal anything from your background in chemistry here, but essentially that is in part where that comes in, isn't it? Because the other thing is people can put themselves at real danger as well if they start to try and make ammunition and it isn't of a good quality, because things that go bang can go bang on you as well and injure you. So you can also find situations where the criminal use of firearms results in the injury of the criminal who's using the firearm.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, when you're talking about injuries, something as simple as the incorrect holding of a firearm results in an injury. So one of the great ones is with something like what we call a semi-automatic. So one pull of the trigger, it actions the firearm so that what you normally see is a cartridge case being ejected from the firearm, for example. If you hold your thumb and your index finger in the wrong place, the automatic movement of that firearm is actually going to cut the webbing between your fingers. And that's a great source of DNA. It's a great source of, hairs, etc. Some really brilliant forensic evidence, but also some notable damage, which is quite characteristic of I don't really know how to use this firearm, but I've used it.
Yeah.
Also, shotguns, for example, really powerful ammunition, really big kick. There's a stock on that firearm that is big because it is a powerful weapon. If you don't put it in your shoulder properly, you could actually dislocate your shoulder as a result of that. And so this is actually sometimes where knowledge within hospitals, A&E, could really give us some really good information about firearm related injuries that actually aren't from individuals like victims being hit or being shot at. This could also be intelligence for law enforcement around actually the criminals themselves that may have actually utilized these firearms. Okay, they may have not have ended up in A&E, they may be at the GP, or they normally just then don't actually see anybody and don't want to highlight themselves as being a potential criminal shooter.
It could be marks or bruising on the body or burn marks or injuries, for example, that are inexplicable, that could potentially all be sources of evidence, as you say. Yeah. And again, just even in saying that, that doesn't accord with very often how we think about the kind of criminal use of firearms. We think of these sort of sophisticated offenders who are all, they know what they're doing. But in actuality, and this is where, again, your role is really interesting, because you do the shooting of guns, don't you? So it's not just a
sometimes,
kind of,
yeah. So it depends where I am.
No, I shouldn't say that. I've revealed that one as almost as a kind of like Rachel wanders around shooting guns around Stoke-on-Trent, which I can absolutely
definitely don't.
It's not the case. But again, even in doing that, I mean, I've fired weapons, but I suspect a lot of people haven't. And when you were saying about the kick of a shotgun and so on, you're absolutely right. It's also far harder to hit the target than a lot of people recognise. And I mean, one of the things that we see, even where well-trained, for example, police marksmen, under pressure, often bullets go astray and they miss the target. And we've seen that in the background to cases as well, like being from Birmingham, the New Year's Eve shooting of Charlene Ellis and Letitia Shakespeare. They happened to be stood some way away from the intended target, but the person who pulled the trigger didn't account for the recoil of the weapon, and it ended up hitting the two girls.
Or ricochet, so it hits a surface and then hits somebody else.
Yeah.
Or the other one is celebratory fire. So some cultures do this as part of their culture, and
shoot the gun in the air.
New Year's Eve, shoot into the air. Well, gravity, that bullet, that projectile has to come back down, and it has actually killed children. It has absolutely injured people because of the fact they've not necessarily thought about the consequences of their actions. They didn't mean to do anything illegal. May have been a completely legal firearm. Just the wrong use of that firearm has resulted in maybe them going to jail for a very long time. I mean, just illegal possession of certain firearms could be a mandatory 10 years in jail just for having that object. So, if someone asks you to hide something or store something, that you could be absolutely the person who is sent to jail for that illegal possession alone.
And we also see that kind of linkage around firearms in groups, don't we? Because there is the tendency, for example, because of the difficulty of accessing firearms and because they are quite rare, that if a group have got hold of an active and working firearm, again, against what is sometimes portrayed in the media, the last thing that they're going to do is leave it at the scene once a crime has been committed, because it has a value, not just an evidential value for the police, but it has a value, so that they keep hold of it.
Yeah, I mean, a really, really interesting point that you make there, James, because, and that comes in ebbs and flows. So when I did my Churchill Fellowship, for example, I went to France, went to the US, and I went to South Africa. And one of the things that was really interesting, amongst a whole bunch of stuff that, we could talk about for years, is that, like, the commodity, the value of a firearm very much can ebb and flow within not only within a local environment, so within your community, but also on a regional or an international scale. So, for example, if the supply of those firearms or the ammunition is there's a high level of them, actually what you can find is that the criminals just dispose of them. They use them once, they get rid of them, they pass them on. Whereas actually, if it's quite hard to get hold of that ammunition or that firearm, then what they do is they do tend to hold on to it. And then they use it in repeat crimes, maybe not the same person utilising that firearm, but it could be passed around potentially between or rented out. So there might be one person that has a collection of firearms that are then distributed, or it might be that there's a strategy, some organization behind how that firearm, where the ammunition comes from, who utilizes it, etc. And so one of those misconceptions is that, if we don't collect the right evidence from firearms, from ammunition, actually we can't always indicate, or we can't indicate, who actually pulled the trigger. And so there's also a distinction between, the types of charge that law enforcement can even sort of attribute to a firearm crime.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really interesting one because, again, even from my home city, there are classic kind of examples. Again, that sort of shogun culture in the UK, because there's what's known as gun number 6, for example, which was great. A great sort of documentary film made about, which was a firearm that was passed around through the criminal.
CZ-75, yeah.
Yeah, CZ-75, that was used in the shooting. I think the first shooting of a postmaster, and then gangland execution. And the gun kind of gets passed between different criminal groups, which we suspect is also around kind of it being sold or exchanged or hired or rented, which again, people perhaps might not necessarily expect with firearms, but they can be held centrally by someone who will loan them out, and the fee that you pay depends, for example, on whether it's been fired or not, because that impacts on its value. So there's a lot that can be known, but also it can kind of muddy the water when it comes to investigation, because that it's been used in this context, in this situation, doesn't necessarily mean that the same person is then going to use that gun in another one, and it's not so. And again, I without wanting to kind of go back to my favourite topic of Line of Duty, it seems, but you sort of, in Jed Mercurio's Line of Duty, it's the organised crime group that are kind of converting the weapons that are then going to be used by the organised crime group. Well, actually, it's a bit nonsense. A stolen sawn-off shotgun, for example, could be passed around a different criminal group, then outside, and then back in, and so the questions that you might be answering for the police or the authorities are: is this the same weapon? Has it been used by the same person? Because potentially there are ways that you can give some indication into whether it's the same person using it or different people using it in different contexts as well. Is there?
Yeah, so fingerprint and DNA evidence can be important but in terms of a forensic firearm examiner, some of the things that what they will be looking at is linking the gun itself to the fired ammunition the parts that are recovered either from the victim, from the crime scene, or on the suspect or on an individual. And they will potentially be involved in estimating how far the shooting may have been, or shooting incident reconstruction. So they might have bullet holes or projectile impact damage in trees, walls, doors, windows, trying to then determine where that shot could have been fired from, and then trying to then find associated fired evidence, so fired bullets, fired cartridge cases, which are not the same things, by the way. Terminology in the media is appalling.
Can you explain the differences, Rachel, just so that, because our listeners would probably find that interesting. What is the difference?
Okay, great question. So most ammunition that we would think of being used in illegal shooting activity, modern ammunition is basically a cartridge. So some people call this a round of ammunition. That's fine, but a cartridge of ammunition, and in that is a projectile, or it could be multiple projectiles, and a cartridge case. So primarily there are the two fired components that we would use to link shooting incidents or firearm discharges together. So the cartridge case may stay in the firearm. So most shotguns, for example, they don't automatically eject cartridge cases. Even a pump action shotgun, that classic ka-ching, cha-ching, noise that we hear in films, etc. That's manually operated, and so they may not eject the cartridge case at the scene. If it stays in that firearm, and most firearms don't get found at the crime scene, that's going to have gone somewhere else. Really important forensic evidence and information about the ammunition has gone. The projectile, this could be a single object. Most people just call these bullets, but a bullet is designed for certain types of firearms. So pistols, revolvers, rifles, for example, but not shotgun. So generally shotguns shoot lots of pellets, or at least a few different spherical balls in one round of ammunition, one cartridge. And so they're called shot. Some people do call them pellets, but, and if you're talking about air rifles or air pistols, well, they're not bullets at all. They are pellets. If you're talking about airsoft weapons, again, so the projectile has certain terms depending on the ammunition or the type of firearm that's being used.
Absolutely. And as you say, it leads to these stories, for example, where you will read a story about someone brandishing a firearm, but that firearm could, it could be an air pistol or a ball bearing repeater or a BB gun. Yeah. At the same time, it could actually be, as you say, a revolver with a cartridge, and a much more. So again, it's that kind of that can cloud things in terms of potentially what we're looking at, and of course all can do harm, so potentially all can be used in criminal cases as well. So there's, I certainly do know of instances where, for example, ball bearing repeater guns have been used in criminal shootings, for example. But that will be reported as a firearms crime and a man was shot and so on. But clearly, the damage that's done to the individual could be very serious. But we're also not necessarily talking about a weapon as people would necessarily always think about.
Yeah, particularly with some of the low-powered weapons, people don't think of them they don't give those weapons the same respect that they would, in terms of health and safety. I don't mean respect as in, my status or my power. They don't give them the level of respect that they should do. And absolutely, there have been fatalities of children, fatalities of adults, teenagers playing around with air rifles and air pistols in particular, even ones that are completely legally owned. You don't need a license to hold them, and have ended up shooting their best friends or killing a child because of their lack of awareness around the potential lethality and harm that they can do. I mean, just as an example, a pistol, what people might say is a 9mm pistol, that bullet can travel about a mile, if it is if there is no target or no object that stops its path. And people may think that distance may only apply to high caliber rifles or something like that. It doesn't. Quite low powered firearms, not as low power obviously as an air weapon, but they can go a very long way if they're shot at the right angle and in the right environment or landscape.
Well, on that very theme, I was watching something the other day where footballers were being interviewed about memories of other footballers, and it involved the telling of a story involving Gaza, Paul Gascoigne, and his friend Jimmy Five Bellies at England training, where Gaza attended with his new rifle, his air rifle, and proceeded to shoot his mate Jimmy Five Bellies in the backside, which was a source of huge amusement and fun for the footballers that were watching it. And this was being retold on the BBC, and you kind of think, yes, but at the same time, the messages that are sent out, when also at the same time, and as you say, they can be, while there can be a real kind of anxiety, for example, about firearms that aren't routinely or regularly encountered. The Glock 9mm is not going to be held by very many criminals in serious organised crime groups in the United Kingdom. Air weapons held by young men, for example, are quite apparent and do result in injuries, and then will be recorded as firearms offences.
Lots of criminal damage occurs, through the use of air weapons. And actually, when you look at the statistics around England and Wales, for example, level of firearm crime, because air weapons are classified as a firearm, if the projectile, the pellet, has more than a joule of energy, and so most air weapons are therefore classified as a firearm. By our law, not necessarily in other countries' law, but they are in the UK. And so, as a result, most of the shootings or the illegal actions that we know about, a lot of those statistics come from the use of air weapons. And so the actual use of non-air weapons, so your more rifles, pistols, shotgun, etc., they're actually quite a small proportion, and that number has drastically dropped from the early and mid 2000s, where the numbers were significantly higher in terms of what we see. But I mean, if you think about the types of crime that are committed that we know about, with non-air weapons and air weapons combined, your violence against the person is topmost ranking, predominantly with the more energetic types of firearms, let's say. Whereas if you look at criminal damage, most of that proportion is conducted by less lower powered weapons, such as your BB guns, your air rifles, etc. And so, different types of criminal offence also have a different profile of what type of firearms typically get used, in the UK. And imitation weapons, for example, these are replica guns, so could be BB guns, they could be blank firing pistols. Those imitation firearms, because they're used as threat, people obtain these weapons, to either demonstrate power visibly or to entice and elicit threat and fear and control. They may not actually be able to do any harm or any damage, but they have them as a visible feature, so that, because it is so hard to differentiate between a live firearm that I mean live as in it could fire a projectile and cause some hurt, versus an object, basically.
And when it comes to the policing of it, for police and particularly firearms officers, the ability to differentiate is going to be, and because as you've just said, you really can't. If someone's pointing a weapon at you, they're pointing a weapon at you. There is going to be no pause for thought about whether or not that's an imitation firearm, an air weapon, or so. So when police are, but it does mean that, for example, police are, when they can be called to, or armed police can be called to all sorts of firearms crime, for example, deploying. So, it could be someone with an air weapon firing shots on the canal side, but you might well end up with, red laser dots on you and armed firearms officers telling you to get down on the floor.
Yeah, because you shouldn't, it is against the law to have a firearm in a public place.
Yeah.
And also, members of the community in the UK, they will report any type of potential firearm related offence, because of, and particularly if they're in, rural environments or areas maybe where they don't expect there to be firearm related crime. And this is not good image, for us to see. But also likewise, shooting a domestic animal and injuring it, criminal offence. Shooting a swan, protected species, criminal offence. Even whatever firearm or object you're using to cause that injury. Likewise, we've had cases where you've seen, a school group doing some filming for a homework project or some coursework, and they've taken out an imitation firearm in the middle of the street, and a neighbour has been alarmed because literally you can't tell, and you literally have to hold them. The real one, I say real as in the one that's capable of actually shooting somebody versus the one that's not capable of shooting someone. And you need sometimes experts to be able to differentiate them. And of course, if they've been deactivated, you can't see that from the outside of the gun.
And of course now as well, we have the world of social media, for example, where people might think it very cool to pose on their social media holding or clutching an imitation weapon, but for the authorities, they're not going to be able to tell the difference. And similarly, we've even seen it with toys, haven't we? Whereby toy weapons, and I know sometimes it can get into the kind of ridiculous case where people are sort of saying, well, this is the child had a Nerf gun, but the thing is, if you're the call handler, the dispatcher for the police who's got to send officers, the minute that it's reported to you as a firearms crime, the response in the UK, which again people don't. As a final thing, of course, and again, it's one that I think people don't necessarily get, but firearms can discharge all sorts of projectiles. So incapacitant sprays and tasers, for example, as used by the police, require firearms training, and those are regarded as firearms as well. So a kind of further level of complexity that people aren't necessarily aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. It often the type of evidence, that is so important to police, to law enforcement, to your community officers. Any information that you have about things that are happening in your community, you don't have to ring 999 or call the police and report it to them necessarily. Even if it's a community leader who you can tell information to about what's happening in your community is so very important to us understanding and being able to investigate and provide, justice to society, and also to try and prevent criminal actions within your community. We can only go by the information that comes to us and the crimes that get reported. And we know so much of it doesn't, for lots of justifiable reasons. But if we don't gather the evidence, we can't help with the intelligence gathering, and we can't help prosecute. And often what we find is that those really serious bloodshed incidents could have actually been, the person or the weapon. We could have found out who they are or link them to a less severe crime. So for example, if you do, like James, like you just mentioned, James, someone shooting an air rifle, we can get forensic evidence from air rifle pellets, as long as they're packaged appropriately and they don't get damaged. We can link shootings together, even if those shootings weren't revolving in an injury, or criminal damage. If we can recover that, then we can link them potentially together. And likewise, if we can, through what we have in the UK is the National Ballistics Intelligence Service, so NABIS. Yes, it was, you might have seen it on Line of Duty. James, obviously, you mentioned the National Crime Agency, who deal very much more with that, the transnational element, the UK and other countries, as do NABIS. But NABIS's primary role is about gathering intelligence and forensic evidence to do with shootings in the UK. So on a national scale, and then supporting, international investigations as well, as the National Crime Agency. And so, by all police forces working, together, we've got regional organised crime units or ROCUs. We have lots of strategies and task forces in place in law enforcement, in border force. So trying to police and identify weapons and ammunition coming into the UK, going out of the UK, and moving around the country as well. Any information that you have is so vital to us being able to navigate through the complexity of information. And one of the things that I'd particularly say is, whilst we know that there are these higher gun crime areas, your urban areas, in London, the West Midlands, Merseyside, even West Yorkshire is featuring very highly in terms of our gun crime. The regions that actually are between those areas, Staffordshire, for example, it is a prime commuter route. I don't want to necessarily say trafficking, but if you say trafficking is the movement of firearms and ammunition illegally, then it is a prime commuter route. Yes, Staffordshire has very, very low gun crime levels. However, there might be lots of gun crime happening in Staffordshire that just we're not aware of. And that is maybe a source for firearms.
Absolutely. And of course, the thing about places like Staffordshire, and this is, again, is that breaks down some of the kind of urban rural breakdown, is that we do know it's going to be those rural areas where there's high legal ownership of firearms. And so there's a kind of relevance there as well for the kind of enhancing the knowledge of safety when it comes to abidance with the legislation on the storage of firearms and ensuring that they're properly kept and so on, because we, as we said, there is that kind of movement of legitimately held weapons sometimes into criminals' hands, and you don't want that because the very high harm that can result from the availability of illegal firearms.
And it definitely doesn't have to just be organised criminals. Criminals know that where the sources of legally held firearms are, and they absolutely do target those areas, and they do go out and steal from those areas, so that they can establish a source. And that's why our firearm discharges in the UK are really quite high for shotguns, because they are legally held, they are available, and therefore it is absolutely an easier source of identifying and getting those commodities that they so rightly or they so want to have.
So, keeping firearms, including the legitimate ones, well away, and in the proper gun cabinets as they should be, and so on, is a really important crime prevention in a way as well. So it's a fascinating area, which, like I say, when you kind of begin at the start, there is very much this sort of like, it's all going to be young lads running around with, with pistols shooting at each other, supplied by these shadowy groups. And that's not to suggest that those things in part don't happen, but the picture is much, much more complex than initially kind of first appears around users and
I mean, the Paul Edmonds case, so Operation Gold Dust, for example, this was a guy in his 60s who, had the background, was able to manufacture what they did call at the time obsolete caliber ammunition, who was able to acquire. He had a registered firearm dealer. He was a registered firearm dealer. He had antique weapons, and he made ammunition particularly for those and to get around the legislation and the law, because antique weapons weren't defined then, and he the guns and the ammunition were associated with 100 different crimes within the UK, and that's just one example of a conspiracy basically to transfer prohibited firearms and ammunition in this country, and there are other cases as well that you can see, but he falsified paperwork, he falsely signed customs information stating that firearms were antiques when they weren't. There's so many parts and people involved with these trafficking chains, and the supply and the demand side of not only gun crime but so many different types of crime, that the police have to try and unpick and find out, all of these different parts and strands, and use all of that information to try to build a case and investigate, who has, created, who has imported, who has supplied, where's the demand coming from, who might have bought these, who's likely to use them, where are they likely to be used. I mean, there's another firearm, Link Series 4, and the first shooting of that, I think, was in Glasgow, and then it moved down to the Midlands, and I think a similar incident occurred with gun number 6. And so most of the criminal use that we know of has taken place in quite a small sort of circumference, and a small geographic area, but there is that potential for the actual firearm and or the ammunition to have come from and been used in crime, either in Europe or in the UK or the US, anywhere potentially, just through transferring it through the post.
And this is perhaps a place where we can end as well, because it's an interesting one, because we talked about 3D weapons, but the one the printing of weapons, which is getting a lot of media attention, but the thing that interests me in a way is your thoughts exactly on that, the way in which weapons might move in a more networked world, particularly around legitimate systems of transportation of cargo. Because if we've seen one thing that's certainly risen in England and Wales during COVID, we're buying more and more products online, and there's a much bigger industry around shipping goods, locally and globally, and that in and of itself does raise questions, even though we are an island, about and I say that this at exactly the same time as well. We ought to also remember that the government is on the back of exiting the European Union, for example, is talking about the building of free ports, for example. Now that does, those two things come together for me, interestingly, because they do create what could be quite conducive conditions to transporting of weapons, where people don't necessarily need to be networked in quite that connected way. And actually, are we looking at the right things when we express our concern about printed and 3D printed weapons? Or actually, is the threat much more that we're missing the more obvious ones, which are has always been both our legitimately owned weapons in people's homes, but then the secondary part, the shipment of weapons using legitimate systems. And I'd be interested to know your thoughts, Rachel. Where does the real threat come from? The bigger threat come from, do you think?
If you ask me to identify one, I'm not sure I could, because I think the sources are so diverse.
Are you concerned about printed guns particularly?
I would say right now, no, but I know that there is increasing occurrence of 3D printed weapons. Now, but the media doesn't necessarily articulate what level of 3D printing has gone on. And so, you know, if we're talking about a complete 3D plastic firearm, yes, there is the potential. Yes, you can shoot one, if not a couple of rounds of ammunition from these, and they, you know, are and they can be quite well made. But that's not necessarily easy to do. It isn't as simple as downloading some 3D CAD drawing and telling a printer to go print it. You know, you do have to actually understand the chemistry behind how 3D printing works. Which types of polymer do you actually add into the machine? What kind of strength and what weaknesses is it going to have? And
it's expensive.
And if you do metal, at the moment it is still quite expensive, and if metal 3D printing may have a maybe more of a concern in the future, but again, even more expensive, you know, because of the nature of the materials and the technology. But 3D printing isn't just about a whole firearm. It can be a tiny little part. And, you know, they've 3D printed parts.
Or just the cartridge, the ammunition.
Pardon?
Or just the cartridge or the ammunition in some ways.
Yeah, so I mean, I would probably say less likely for ammunition components, because I mean, in most modern cartridges of ammunition, you're talking about 2000 degrees Celsius of temperature when a round of ammunition ignites. You know, these are not cold things when you fire them. They cool down pretty rapidly. But if you pick a fired cartridge case up like immediately after discharge, you're going to burn potentially fingers. You know, not not third degree burns, but you know, you're going to feel it. They're really, really quite hot, particularly if you're using any form of, you know, automatic fire. You know, the more cartridges you discharge, the hotter that weapon's going to get. You know, if you make something called a slam gun, you know, basically 2 bits of pipe with a welded firing pin in it, you know, that piece of metal that you're holding is going to get hot. You know, and it's those kind of, and actually potentially slam guns are in the UK potentially more of a threat to us at the moment than 3D plastic firearms. But you know, the media portrays 3D plastic firearms as things that are invisible. No, they're still made of material. The X-ray can still see them. They're just not as obvious as something that's metallic, because they don't absorb as much of the X-ray, you know, when they're being imaged. But you can see it shaped like a gun. You know, there's no you know, even things that are packaged inside something else, you know, you can still see there's a difference in the density of the material. You know, so you can, if you know what you're looking for, see it.
Yeah, they don't make guns to look like cups and saucers, really, do they? You know, it's fairly standardised. But no, it is an interesting one, because I do think it's interesting, particularly given the kind of the networks and particularly there is concern. There's clear concern as well in the UK about the potential not only for guns to fall into the hands of criminals, but the reason that the National Crime Agency are very much involved, I would suggest, is it's that interplay between those who are ideologically rather than financially motivated that they're also concerned about, it's not just the criminals that they're anxious about, but certainly I think, well, on one hand, the last year's given us kind of falling levels of firearms crime. Certainly not a time for complacency. It would,
and as shown, with the statistics looking at loads of different types of offences over the lockdown period. After that period of drop, they basically came back to normal again straight after lockdown. And firearms are considered as a national strategic priority, and therefore the greater the public awareness around firearm related crime, firearm related evidence, the more that even general frontline police officers are aware of that evidence, of that the sources of information, of any aspect of firearm and weapon related crime, the more capable they're going to be at their investigations, at detecting that crime has even occurred, at investigating it and ultimately prosecuting it in the long run.
Well, I mean, I couldn't really do a better summing up than that. But just to say, Dr. Rachel Bolton-King, I think in everything that you've said, anyone listening is going to come away far more educated about firearms and the realities of guns. I certainly have learned things that I didn't know, and for that a huge thanks for joining us. And if people are interested in and want to learn more, obviously Staffordshire University, we run all manner of different courses in the Faculty of Law, Policing and Forensics, from forensic science, where you can learn from Rachel, through to criminology and of course policing related courses. But also just to suggest that you might want to look at Rachel on Twitter, because she is one of the kind of active and engaged academics from Staffs who does talk about guns and crime, and I'm sure she'd like to and happily engage if people had questions or wanted to know more.
Definitely.
It's a fantastic topic, and it's one that, and as we say, hopefully firearms crime in all its guises remains rare, and police officers don't encounter it. But should they do so, I think you've given them and anyone else who's listening lots to think about and consider. So Rachel Bolton-King, thank you ever so much. If you're interested in this podcast, you can find out more about Staffordshire University and law, policing, forensics on our podcasts, which now cover a whole array of different topics, from Series 1, focusing more generally on crime, to now Series 2, where we're looking at policing. You can find out more about studying at Staffordshire University at staffs.ac.uk. And all it remains for me to do is to thank once again Dr. Rachel Bolton-King. That was interesting, engaging, useful, and brilliant. So Rachel, thank you very much.
And thanks for having me. It's been great fun.
Cheers.
Happy to interact with anyone who has questions or would like to know more.
So anyone writing scripts as well, if you want to know the reality of guns rather than the myths, given that we've criticised the media a lot, Rachel is to be engaged. What's the Twitter hashtag, Rachel?
At Dr. Rachel BK.
At Dr. Rachel BK. So there you go. Track her down if you're interested. Rachel, thank you ever so much, and I hope you found this interesting, and do tune in for more policing on Crime Tapes.